Irene Guijt. I am going to be chairing this session. I'm the head of evidence and strategic learning at Oxfam, Great Britain. Work with all the evidence processes, including research, and was at the very birth of this initiative together with Duncan and several of my colleagues. We're here, Filippo, Artuso, Katrina Barnes, Irene de Goede, and it was has been a wonderful collaboration with AFSI so far from the International Inequalities Institute at LSE, and Armina and several fellows are also online. So thank you. This is really exciting for us because we've been building up to a kind of a bigger launch of this when the conversations can really start. There've been a lot of one-on-one small group chats so far. Basically, I want to just give a little bit of a background to the project and walk you through the flow of the session, and then we can kick off with the first presenter. So in April and May, several of us, many of us actually started noticing all kinds of bubbling initiatives, lots of urgent and necessary citizen action and responses to the COVID crisis. And it just very quickly became quite overwhelming in terms of, oh my goodness, how can we understand this, support this, work with this? And it became evident that people were working on their own little networks, on their topics in their specific geographies. And we felt that it would have merit to just connect the dots and bring people together to make sense of what was going on. What patterns are we seeing in terms of the kinds of agency that are coming up? And is it in fact emerging agency? This was just a name that we kind of thought up at the time, because for us it was emerging, but for others it's just more of the same, or pivoting agency. So these are some of the questions that we felt were really important to explore. And also because we felt that there might be new tactics we were seeing, new forums, new collaborations, new issues that were emerging, all very exciting, new models for feminist leadership. We were documenting a few of them through the Power Shifts and the Power in the Pandemic podcasts, which are Oxfam platforms, but there were so many others that were out there sharing so much of it at IDS, Carnegie, and lots of other places. So one of the big, I guess, energies behind this global conversation, as how I'm seeing it, is how can these efforts, where positive, of course, be supported, inform some of the building back better policy and practice directions that are setting up, and how can they help us rethink and reinvigorate or some of the work that's going on, much of the work that's going on with civil societies. So to just start off the conversation, today we have three people who are sitting on top of huge topics and have been doing some of that harvesting and synthesizing and making sense on their specific topics. We have Catherine Marshall, who works closely with Olivia Williams on faith-based organizations, a huge, vast body of work that they've been also documenting very regularly and sharing online. We have Yogesh Gore from Coady, who's been working on the livelihoods aspects of it. And we have Lawrence Cox, who's been the face associated with a lot of social movements literature and the wonderful and extensive Interface journal that documents dozens and dozens of these kinds of experiences. So they will each walk us through what they're seeing from their particular niches. And as we listen and as we have time for questions, the three that really stand out is what are these forms of agency that we're seeing? Are they new? Are they pivots? What's exciting? What's worrying perhaps? And what kind of thoughts might be bubbling up already about the kind of enduring impacts that these experiences may have for the organizations themselves as they talk together, and how institutions, governments, and donors might be able to respond. So those are the kinds of just questions that are kind of in the back of our minds. We also have Duncan Green here, who's Oxfam Great Britain's Senior Strategic Advisor, and he will be in discussion with the presenters after each of their presentations. We are recording this, so if you are uncomfortable with that, then well, that's what we're doing so that other people can have access to it later on, just for your information. Could you all make sure that you're muted unless you have a chance to speak right at the end? And is there anything else, Filippo, that I might have forgot to mention at this stage? I think we're all sorted. Right. So the flow of the event as follows is we'll start off with Catherine, who will walk us through what she and Olivia and others have been observing around faith-based. We will then move to Lawrence and social movements and round off with Yogesh. And we'll have some time in between for Duncan to pick up on a few salient points and observations that also relate to the paper that we've slowly been generating, that some of you might have seen, more questions than answers. It's trying to collect and collate and cluster some of the areas of questioning that the next months hopefully will allow us to uncover. The link is in the chat box. Filippo's just posted it there again. And then please type in your questions as you go. So the idea of the questions are that they have a function now. We have half an hour at the end of the webinar to explore some of these. But more importantly, these questions will also drive some of the discussions in the thematic clusters. And I'll come back and explain the idea of clusters all the way at the end. So don't be worried if your questions aren't answered right now. They will still shape the discussions as we go forward. The webinar is simply a kickoff for what will be many more moments of connecting around this topic. So I think we are ready to start. So first up, Catherine. Catherine Marshall, she's a senior fellow at the Barclays Center for Religion, Peace and World Affairs, and she leads the work on religion and global development. She's been a professor in practice of development, conflict and religion at the Walsh School of Foreign Service. And she now serves as well as the executive director of the World Faiths Development Dialogue. I know she's been super busy and has squeezed us into her many duties, including around the G20 Interfaith Association processes, and brings vast experience also from having led the World Bank's faith and ethics initiatives in the early 2000s. So Catherine, over to you. And I believe you have a screen to share.
Good morning, good afternoon. There we go. Let me give a first bit of background, which is that I worked for many years in the World Bank, primarily Africa, but also Latin America, East Asia, was part of many different task forces and so forth, with really nothing to do with the world of religion until Jim Wolfenson drafted me in late 1999 to help with an initiative that he had started with the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Aga Khan, Echegaray from the Vatican, etc. And for various reasons, I was drawn more and more deeply into it. And so for the last roughly 20 years have looked at development challenges and humanitarian, primarily through the lens of the religious worlds, but also what came out of the early discussions and the controversies, which is ethics. So that's the perspective that I bring, which is very much focused on development, but now looking essentially through a religious lens. So if I can figure out how to move my screen. There we go. I will have 6 main points that I wanted to make. And I sometimes get carried away, so I thought I would make these points in the beginning. The first and immediate preoccupation that we had is that there tends to be in reviews of development and civil society, etc., a separation or an exclusion of this world of religion. And our basic argument is that they belong as a part of our understanding of what is happening in the world. There are 2 obvious reasons. One is the often quoted Pew Research Forum Center principle, a finding that 84% of the world's people have a religious affiliation. Now, what that really means and how that translates is complicated, but some recent studies have showed the wide gulf between some of the wealthier countries and some of the poorer countries in this religiosity. In other words, how do religious organizations and beliefs and practices translate into their behavior? So our basic argument is that faith belongs at the table. The other factor, which is that a lot of surveys are showing higher levels of trust. That seems to be somewhat eroded, but that's still important. So that's sort of where we started as we looked at this emergent agency issue. The second that we bring is that several of us, by the way, it's Olivia Wilkinson, who is with the Joint Learning Initiative, and a number of organizations here are part of this effort, which has been going since 2012. So Olivia, from that effort, actually Dave Robinson, who has spent many years at World Vision, the three of us in early March realized from our experience with the Ebola crisis, AIDS, malaria, et cetera, that the religious responses would be significant, important, interesting. And so we agreed, really, without much ado, to start an effort to track and to follow what was happening. Interestingly, because of the Korean church issue and the Tablighi Jamaat, which emerged as super spreaders, the religious element was more visible in this COVID crisis than it had been in the past. But it still is hugely complicated, hugely important. So that's what we have been doing since early March, is keeping track in every way that we can. And I'm going to go through the 6 categories that we're looking at. And I want to be very clear that we're looking at the good. In other words, what's wonderful and noble, showing the unity of humanity, et cetera. But we also are looking at the bad. We're looking at the beautiful and the ugly. I still remember in one meeting in Cape Town where somebody was talking about religion in Africa, saying we have good religion, we have bad religion, and we have very, very bad religion and very good. So I think that recognition is important. We're very much focusing and hoping to gain through this effort, what do we know and what do we not know? And how can we find out more? How wide a net should we cast in trying to look at this? And we get classically into all of the issues of definitions. And then the way that categories emerge, which the Emergent Agency Project is clearly struggling with, so are we. And I'm thinking of some things that, like for the interfaith response is something we're interested in, but how are the arts coming into it? How do we deal with some of the macro issues like the debt and finance, where there are some major initiatives underway? We've been very struck, of course, as always, in looking at the ways in which religion plays in the global agendas, the development agendas, by the issues of fragility. And what's happening, what are religious communities doing in the really tough situations? So that's been a major focus that we look at. And then, as we've heard already, all of us are looking ahead at, build back better, fair, greener, fairer, build back forward, looking to deep change. Now, the way that that's often articulated in the religious circles is looking for the prophetic voice. So that is obviously significant, but what is it, and who is really representing these prophetic voices, and who are looking at what is the contrary? So the categories that we have been looking at and that are reflected in the document, we call it a repository, which collects now, well over 100 pages of essentially links. The first one that has clearly been important with lockdowns particularly, and with government restrictions, is gatherings. And what is the significance of the changes that are taking place? Partly moving online, so baptisms online or whatever, but also the communities that have resisted. Secondly, practice has been very important. Issues, sadly, of funerals, burials, and deaths have been very important. But in the discussions about essential services, there's been a sense that spiritual support should be a part of the thinking about what is essential. And I think we're all hoping to see some new thinking about what is essential and what is not. In terms of jobs and in terms of life, of course. So that question of the changes in practices, I think that comes to what we think is already becoming apparent, which is changes in government-religious relationships in a number of places. We're seeing that quite clearly, for example, in West Africa, where the roles of the religious communities, which are mostly informal but very powerful, are likely to be changing. So we want to keep track of that. Third, which in a way is the closest related to what we're talking about here, is the sort of massive mobilization of many different religious communities. First of all, to provide food. Food kitchens are changing their functions, Sikhs, many, many different areas, but also mental health, et cetera, sort of the whole category of social protection. Just within the last couple of weeks, there is a big mobilization around children and the effects on children. A lot of the Religions for Peace is now just at this moment having a large meeting around women and religion and diplomacy. So that is happening. So a massive mobilization, and some of it is very local. I'm struck, my neighborhood. What did my neighborhood have? Sitting in Washington, D.C., one thing they had is we had a bear hunt. So you put stuffed bears in your windows and, give children the chance to sort of map where all the bears are. In other words, psychological, that's not religious, but the point is we're looking at a huge array of very different kinds of responses, some of which seem trivial and some of which are obviously significant. Much less positive is that every pandemic in the past has had cases of scapegoating and the accentuation of different kinds of prejudices. And there are many reports of that. The subcontinent seems to be the most obvious, but in the United States, you had anti-Chinese, people of Asian descent, but you have a lot of other groups that are meeting it, and hate speech, the accentuation of hate speech. So how are religious communities responding to these less attractive responses? A topic that I miss in the sort of framing of this that we started looking at with the U.S. Institute of Peace and with various other networks that are working on peace building is what is actually happening to active conflicts and how are religious communities involved. So South Sudan, Central African Republic, Myanmar, Thailand, Nigeria, Mozambique now, Tanzania, all of the other conflicts that are either longstanding or new. And how are some of the protagonists reacting to COVID? Are they backing off, taking a little bit more time to sort of regroup, or are they taking advantage of the moment that there is? So a lot of questions around what is happening with the peace building world. We've had several webinars trying to get a sense from different parts of the world of what is really happening with conflict areas. And finally, there is already a wide variety of efforts to look further ahead. The most substantial and I guess best documented is the Vatican's task forces, which is a major complex effort that's involved in looking at the rebuilding issues that involves quite a wide network. Georgetown University is actually a part of that, so we're following it quite closely. I did an interview with Monsignor Zampini, which is online for anyone who's interested, as he sort of presents what this Vatican effort is, but there are a lot of others. One that I'm involved in that I think is quite interesting is called Trimegestu, which is out of Morocco, Fez, building on the Fez Festival of Sufi culture. Trismegistus was one of the gods who linked science and arts and faith and spiritual, but it is looking again very much at what kind of world do we want to create? Where do we go? But it's drawing particularly on the arts. So I think that that's an interesting example that I just happen to know about. Clearly, there are many others that are operating at different levels. Just last week, there was a large and very, it certainly wasn't local, it was some of the senior people in the Catholic Church looking at ecological alliances and the way to build networks that are focused on rainforests, particularly biomes, and different ways to protect the environment. So I've already mentioned, but I think that it is an important issue, the challenges and changes in church-state relationships.
Catherine, I was going to give you a little time signal, 2 more minutes, please.
Okay, great. I'm almost done. So some ideas and conclusions. I want to reiterate that religious communities need to be at the table in the COVID discussions. The most immediate issue is the vaccine issue and the issues both of testing, but also production, ethical considerations of priorities. And I think you can make a strong case that without religious engagement, the vaccine process is not going to succeed. And the question then is, how do you do that in a meaningful way? Need for cooperation, solidarity, lived values has never been better. As we all know, we're hearing the dual narratives. One narrative is that everybody's in the same boat. This shows interconnection, brings out the best in humanity, but we also know that the contrary is also quite visible of bringing out the worst. So how do we navigate these two narratives, but more important, these two realities? And I think in all this, we need to be prepared to address questions around human rights, human dignities, human responsibilities, and how do they do, and what kind of process can assure not the seat, but the seats at the tables, both of them plural. And then how do we see the kind of prophetic voice, the Gandhi voice, the Desmond Tutu. We hear, I was listening yesterday to Ella Gandhi from South Africa, who was speaking at the women conference, Vino Aram. There are remarkable male and female voices that again, as my final comment, I am balking increasingly at anything that divides the world into people of faith and people not of faith, because frankly, I think it's a nonsense. As we say, everyone has faith. The question is, what do you have faith in? So that I think it's important to get away from that kind of binary, but not to ignore it, which is so often the case. And it certainly has been the case in the development world, of simply being blind to what is a huge world because of differences in language, preconceptions, etc. And so I'll just close with the symbol that I'm sure you all know, which is crisis and danger and opportunity, the two parts of crisis. And I think that's very much the way we're looking, and we're very much looking to advice and counsel on where we go next with our project. We're doing it on a shoestring, of course, as everyone else. But I know we're very conscious that we should rethink our categories, because some of them have been pretty durable since March, but some of them are clearly changing. And how do we get better information? We know our information is patchy. It's huge. We have a huge amount of information. But for example, somebody pointed out recently that we didn't have much on the Philippines. And when we went looking, we realized there are a huge number of things happening in the Philippines. So we look at any country, we know that we'll find, looking through this religious lens and looking through the COVID lens, we'll find an extraordinary array of very different responses. Some of them very positive and some of them more inwardly looking and more narrow. So with that, I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Wonderful. So difficult to do justice to this topic. So Duncan is going to provoke, deepen, question, open up. He's the Senior Strategic Advisor at Oxfam Great Britain and also Professor in Practice in International Development at the London School of Economics. Some of you might know him through the blog From Poverty to Power. He's just been involved in a lot of effective active citizenship initiatives for many decades. Duncan.
Thanks, Irene, and thanks, Catherine. That was great. And I'm really glad we started with you. At the risk of the binary thing emerging, I must say I'm a lifelong devout atheist, but I've always been fascinated from my early days in Latin America in the role of faith and the role of faith organizations. So I'm an atheist who's really interested in the politics, sociology, and impact of faith organizations and faith. So I'm kind of a hybrid individual. I think some of the things around COVID and the response to COVID are particularly informed by a faith lens. So things like the importance of trust and social cohesion in responding to the pandemic. Things like agency. This project is Emergent agency. And there's this odd phenomenon I've noticed in the NGOs where you go around and talk to your local partners, they're often motivated by their own personal faith. But when we write it up, we kind of airbrush that out. And it's just about social organization and rage, inequality, and lots of other things, which are all true. But somehow the faith disappears. And I think when you're talking about agency, faith is going to be both important as a good driver and important as a brake or an obstacle. And I think putting it back on the table, as you suggest, is great. Two other things. Norm shifts are going to be a crucial part of the response to this in terms of shifting politics as we come out the other side. No one knows better about norm shifts than faith organizations, again, for good and ill, but they do norms in a way that I think civil society organizations sometimes struggle with. And final one, well-being. Again, how much of people's personal well-being in many countries, in many situations, is tied to the ability to exercise their faith and the nature of faith leadership and the nature of faith community. And we've got to put that back on everyone's radar, not just people of faith. I wanted to ask a couple of questions, and one of mine, and then two just asking you to answer your own questions. So my question is, when you look, so stand back, this is a stand back session, and when you look at what's going on, do you see more optimism in terms of change within faith organizations? So crises often tip the balance of power within a particular church or within a particular community. Or do you see more evidence of impact of faith organizations on wider society? So just a little change within or driven by sort of question. And then two things you said, which I thought were really interesting, and then because of time, you had to move on. A change in the relationship between governments and religious communities. What are you seeing? What is that leading to? Marginalization, to a instrumental role of faith communities by government? What's going on there? And you have about a minute to answer all three, I'm afraid. So, and the other one is, you said the impact on conflict was interesting. Well, yeah, I want to know more. So is it making conflict worse, better? But you probably just have to choose one of those, to be fair. But anyway, over to you, Irene. Thank you very much.
Well, the basic answers are it's complicated and it depends. From the point of view of changes of religious organizations, I really think we don't know yet, but it's worth remembering that a lot of religious organizations are facing massive financial crises because they're not able to pass the plate because they're not meeting in person. So a lot of schools will close, hospitals are closing. So a lot of sort of very practical upheavals that are at a minimum accelerating change. I think that's one sense in the US that's going to accelerate the changes in Catholic education. The religion state, the public health directives that are involved in COVID are really testing the boundaries of religious freedom. In other words, who decides? And there are a lot of religious organizations that are cooperating. The vast majority are cooperating. They want to live. But the ones that don't are really objecting, for example, that liquor stores may be open whereas churches are closed. So the question is, who's deciding? So all of the questions around who has the authority to regulate religious organizations is being tested in many different countries in different ways. And the conflict, there is this whole peace building world, which I think probably should be more involved in this project because it's a large, complicated set of different actors. And we still, again, are taking stock of what is happening to the religious dimensions. But the U.S. Institute of Peace, for example, has constant webinars around what's happening more broadly in the peace building world, as are some other organizations. The network of religious and traditional peace builders that's supported by Finchurch Aid, the Finnish government is very much involved. Is very much looking at, what is actually happening, including specifically during the COVID pause. In other words, as people are not able to continue their work, what are they doing and what's happening to the protagonists? I was just reading a report on the Central African Republic last night that again is looking at sort of local authorities and how that is being affected by what is happening with the COVID emergencies, because of course the lockdowns have more effect than the actual health dimension. But it's just to come back to my basic answer, it's complicated. And it varies. That is one of the things people fail to realize is the enormous diversity of the religious worlds. That the sense that there is a faith sector, to me, is a nonsense. We're talking about a huge set of very different organizations.
Thank you enormously, Catherine, for opening us to this world, really, as you say, a complicated and diverse world. And we have the clusters that will follow on from this particular webinar to dive much deeper and help unpack and question and ask. So I'd like to move on to the second topic, social movements. So Lawrence Cox is Associate Professor in Sociology from the National University of Ireland in what I'm not going to pronounce, focusing extensively on engaged and participatory approaches to movement, Marxism and social movement, ecology movements, all kinds of justice struggles led by what we in Oxfam call grassroots. A very, very wide set of publications, of course, and the one that we've been drawing on heavily has been that fabulous, fat and incredible volume of Interface, the journal that you co-founded with a special issue on social movements and COVID. Over to you, Lawrence.
Okay, thanks. Hope that sound issue's sorted. And just to say, if anybody wants to have a look at that issue of Interface, it's free online. Very easy to find. So I'm going to talk briefly, laying out a bit of what we're seeing, and then I'll raise a few questions. But I want to say, I suppose, that part of the importance of social movements is getting away from wishful thinking, because so much of the punditry is sheer wishful thinking. It's saying, the virus tells us this, or after the virus X, or whatever. And of course, unless power relations change, this is simply not going to happen. And the US, which has been invoked already, fairly clearly in the new administration, we are going to see the dashing of many of these projected hopes, unless substantial pressure is put on that administration from below, but it's not going to happen automatically. So this is why it's important to look at movements. Now, can I share my screen effectively? Yes, okay, good. So, can I share my screen and show this? Right, okay. So what are we talking about in social movements? Agency that is developing towards networks of individuals, informal groups, and formal organizations. So movements are not individual organizations. They are networks. Networks that are in conflict with other actors. So they're not simply charities, they're not just providing services, they are fighting, usually non-violently, about what way should the world go. And they have a sense of who we are, what we want, and who they are, the people that we are struggling with, but very much internally contested. They are not typically homogeneous or monolithic. And this stuff happens all the time, but it's not very routine. So NGOs, journalists, and academics often struggle to grasp it. The agency is emerging. It's not nice and fixed and institutionalized, routine and easy to talk about. So social movements are quintessentially emergent agency. And we've seen a lot happening in the virus. Movements pushing the state to do something at all about the virus, to include particular groups, strategic workers and others in health and distribution, poor groups, particularly in shanty towns in the global south, whose livelihoods are utterly fragmented. Existing networks like in India shifting from opposing the CAA to emergency responses to migrant workers. Long-standing groups, ecological movements, indigenous struggles, feminist, LGBT, and so on, having to change their focus, change their methods to pivot while fundamentally remaining the same. Organizing around migrant solidarity. Forms like mutual aid, solidarity economy, and food sovereignty that were already significant in some places have proved increasingly significant in the virus. Contesting state power and legitimacy, very visibly in the US, apologies, and in Hong Kong, and then far right and conspiracy theories. So those are some examples of what's been going on. But movements also move in a direction. So those of them which are simply trying to provide services in a crisis quite naturally tend towards seeking funding, seeking professionalization, seeking to end as agency, whereas those which have a focus on political solidarity or mutual aid are often attempting to create that agency out of the same need. And the same kind of issue arises in workplace or community organizing, any kind of interest group really. Is the goal to get the state to step in and restore normality, or is it to bring about some kind of bottom-up social change? Then we have existing movements, some of these I've mentioned, changing their focus, pivoting, and some of those bigger challenges to state power, to capitalism, to racism, which in the nature of things either have to win on quite a large scale or fall back, as we're probably seeing in Hong Kong, for example, and that question rather open at the moment in the US. So movement has a direction. It's not that we're just putting a new piece on the board and it stays there unchanged. Movements move. However, it's really hard to know about this stuff. Emergent agency is always hard to grasp. And as academics, people in NGOs, journalists, and so on, we tend to circulate stories that we like, which we find meaningful, which are often not particularly accurate or representative. They're just good stories, the high status version of Facebook sharing. Part of the reason for that is that journalists, NGOs, academia, and so on struggle to align their own routines with movements, and it is hard to find decent sources. At the moment, it's particularly hard to assess even just the scale of participation outside utterly trivial things like how many people have signed a petition or whatever, let alone its depth. So you can see if X number of people have done something online, but you only really see if the work has happened on the ground in the results. So it's been widely observed that the struggles in the US around Black Lives Matter, defunding the police and so on, show an awful lot of long-term, on the ground activism and organising, in most cases going back well before the virus. But at the moment, confined to our laptop screens, we really don't see it. So we need to assume that more is happening out there than we can see, but that what's going on is less familiar than we would like it to be. Two sets of questions to end with then. One about the context. What are the new challenges that movements are facing, communities in struggle, and groups that have previously not been seeking to be active in that way? What new constraints are people facing? Very visibly, restrictions on gathering, but also individual livelihoods, households, communities, and so on, really struggling just to keep going day to day, subtracts time and energy. What new possibilities are opening up? Obviously organising around basic needs, digital forms of activism, and then what are states doing? Are they repressing? Are they making concessions? Are they, apologies, co-opting, not co-potation? Are they appealing for unity in the greater interest? So what's the context? And lastly then, the movements. So what direction are individual movements going in? Because they try to move and develop agency, but they argue about what they should be doing, where they should be going, and they're not always successful. They have opponents. Where is a particular movement happening and how does it vary? Very much to echo Catherine's point, the fact that an issue exists does not magically mean that movements are going to do the same everywhere. Because emergent agency is contested, there are lots of players involved, it works differently in different places, and we can't know that from the dizzy heights of a think piece. And lastly, who is involved? Because if we want to predict where things are going, the most enduring dimension of any movement is the social worlds of the people who make it up. Both the worlds that they come from, whatever those are, and the worlds that they sometimes create in their struggles. There's a link to our special issue, and I should say as well, Open Democracy have a great series, Open Movements, that looks at some of these same things.
Wow, amazing timing, Lawrence, and so many huge questions again. Duncan, it's all yours.
Yeah. So I just echo what Irene said, that issue of interface journal is absolutely fantastic. I stole various things and stuck them on my blog that are really great from China and Latin Mexico and elsewhere. Very, very good issue. A couple of questions really. You had this great phrase, emergent agency is very hard to grasp. Yes, and that's the entire point of this project. So so one question to you is, I worry that because many of the people on this call and many of the people involved are bound to be already in organizations concerned with social agency of one kind or another, we will see things, as you say, through our own lens, and we will see lots of CSOs and lots of formal organizations doing things, and we will celebrate and talk about them, and we will miss the stuff that doesn't have websites, the stuff that doesn't have write-ups and PhDs attached. And so top tips from you as an editor of a journal that's trying to do this. How do we avoid that sort of bias towards the formal? What can we do to make sure we pick up stuff which is chaotic, new, and unknown? It's an easy question. And then the other question is really, if you look at the history of social movements in Europe, which is what you teach, so I won't try, I'm on dangerous ground here, but my understanding is, you get these spikes of activity, and then the works of Tilly and Tara and people say, underneath those spikes, there are these longer lasting grains of social organization, which coalesce into spikes which are visible to everyone. And then when that spike supposedly disappears, those grains are still there and will work away until the next spike. Is that what we're seeing now? Are we seeing a big spike and then in 2 years' time, actually the vast majority of that will have disappeared and we'll be back to something a bit similar to what was existing pre-COVID? Or what grounds do we have to think that some of this will make a lasting difference to the nature of social organization? The one example I cling to is Mexico in 1986, where the mutual aid response to a massive earthquake, when the government messed up the response badly and stole the money, it morphed into a massive political social movement, which ended up overthrowing the one-party state. Is that the exception, or is that something we will see in many countries?
Well, those are nice small questions, aren't they? So firstly, in terms of how to avoid the bias towards the formal, there is no simple answer, because there's not going to be a simple feed that one can just add in. But what I think you have to do, if you're asking yourself that question, is to leave space around the margins. So not just to go, well, I get my news from this, this, and this, but to be actively listening to what else might be happening and not dismiss it immediately if it doesn't already fit a familiar category or a familiar story. I think is one of the big problems that we have at the moment, is so much of our kind of peripheral information is from media which themselves have their own routines, which specialize, as we know, into forming things into certain kinds of story that we then find meaningful and want to share. So, you know, that bit more skepticism and that bit more listening, which I should say social movements, researchers and activists are doing as well, because of course they also have their own routines and they also need to constantly be on the lookout for what else might be happening that isn't immediately evident. So apologies for not giving you a simple answer there, but yeah, listen more and be skeptical of the sources that we get stuff from, a little bit more skepticism. In terms of what is happening, I think it's going to be extremely varied. And I would say one obvious variable is people's relative trust in the state and the state's relative willingness to work with civil society. So to give an example that's close to home, in Ireland, there was a lot of pressure from civil society for the state to do something. The government ran and put itself at the head of that parade. And even though contention is now increasing in Ireland, I think on the whole, there is still quite a high level of civic trust that even if the government isn't doing everything we want it to, we can push it to do so. So there's a belief in its responsiveness, rightly or wrongly, and therefore less interest in constructing something new. Whereas in the US, clearly, a lot of that has fallen apart, notably and not only for communities of color. And it's been said it is very hard to judge because this is not what's at the top or even the second level of the information we get, but it's widely said that some of the hurricane responses of earlier years, for example, led to new forms of organizing and new forms of alliance building, which underpin some of the movements that we're now seeing. But even that then is probably very different in different cities. And I imagine if you had a Twin Cities story, it would not be the same as an Atlanta story, for example. But I think we can expect that to the extent that people trust the state, which is after all the body that they expect to deal with public health, and that is most active at the moment, they are least likely to try and or feel they have to create new forms of agency. To the extent that the state is absent or experienced as totally hostile or alien, untrustworthy, people are much more likely to start building for the long term.
Duncan, did you want to probe any further, or shall we leave it up to the questions afterwards? There are quite a lot of questions, Lawrence, for you. So I'm wondering if
let's move it on, yeah.
Let's move it on, and you have time to read the questions. And some of these questions are very pertinent to what Catherine has been saying as well. So time for you to absorb. All right, so we've had a particular type of organization with Lawrence. We've had a particular purpose, I guess, diverse purposes of organization with Catherine. And we now have a more, I guess, thematic discussion from Yogesh Gore. He's based at the Coady International Institute in Nova Scotia, and he leads the whole area of inclusive economies, leading on the educational programs, research, and capacity strengthening, and has got a lot of hands-on experience as a practitioner and educator in many parts of the world. Very much focused on social enterprise, the future of work and workers, and part of this transition discussion that we've been talking about already. So Yogesh, it's over to you.
Thank you, Irene, and I'm so pleased to be here. I think what I would be sharing with all of you are some of the things that we are finding from a network of over 9,000 graduates of the Coady Institute in over 130 countries. Because as soon as the lockdown started, and we obviously had to sort of cancel all of our on-campus programs, and very soon we started to sort of engage online with our graduates who are practitioners who are dealing with these challenges on the ground, and many of my colleagues who are there in this webinar. I think Anthony is there, God is there, Irene is there. We all started to engage with our graduates. And a lot of the stories we started to hear, and I believe early on, I think it was some mid-April, I wrote to John. I think John Gaventas is there in the call as well, and Duncan, and sharing some of what we were hearing, and then Duncan just replied back, yeah, this can be a blog. So, and that's how this whole conversation started. And I sort of documented some of the experiences for Duncan's blog. So a lot of this will be some of the examples that we are hearing from our partners and graduates all across the world. And I have sort of 4 key points that I would like to cover. The first one is around when we talk about Emergent agency, and as has been said before, I'm not sure whether it's like Emergent, but a lot more attention has been paid to that agency, and it's being strengthened further, and we have seen a lot of that agency in action during time of COVID. So I would like to focus on some of the community groups, community institutions, and their role in response to COVID and post-COVID. So some of these groups are self-help groups, for example, in South Asia, or Village Savings and Loan Association in Africa, and decades of work that has gone into creating this social capital on the ground. So I'll be talking about that, and how their response has been to the pandemic. Second, I would like to talk about the disruption of the global supply chains because of the pandemic, and its implications on local value chains. Third thing I would like to just touch upon, and I think previous speakers have also talked about, is the area of technology and sudden adoption of technology, and what it means for agency and its implications going forward. And finally, I think it has come up in previous sort of discussion, is the link between these grassroots, emergent communities, citizen-led response with a more formal civil society. So what's the connection between the two? I would like to talk about these 4 things, and hopefully I can do that in 10 minutes. So let me begin with the community institutions, the savings group and the farmer organizations, and how their response was. So, already suboptimal sort of public and private institutions which were providing different services to people, be it health service, education service, social service, economic service, they were all sort of shut down due to lockdowns. And in that kind of a lockdown situation, what did we actually see? What did we hear? What we heard was that some of the social groups, be it the self-help groups of women who already existed on the ground, they got into action very, very swiftly. I remember one of our long-term partner, the Self-Employed Women's Association in India, and their head, Rima Ben. She emailed me a document like end of March, which had a detailed strategy how to fight COVID. And at that point in time, COVID, everybody was trying to figure out how to do it. But in that response was several key activities. For example, awareness raising. This was a very new, and there's a lot of stigma attached to it. So how do you create awareness of a distant concept like a social distancing? How do you communicate to a grassroots member what a social distancing is? Creating that. And then also coming up with the idea that masks are important and mobilizing. So I remember in the blog, that time the number was 20 million masks produced in 2 weeks. That number now stands to 230 million masks produced by women in the informal economy. They learned using YouTube how to make these masks and produced at large scale and at a very, very low cost. Be it taking care of the most disadvantaged during the time of the pandemic. So we know that, and I think Catherine talked about the migrant workers. We saw that once the economy was shut down, there was this massive migration of workers from urban centers to rural areas. Now, these were the workers working on daily wages. They had nothing else but their wage income in the urban centers. Once the lockdown there, when the income was gone, and there was no transportation available, they started walking hundreds of miles back to their villages. Now, as they were walking, who took care of them? It was this group. It was women who took care of them in terms of feeding them. And we actually heard a lot in terms of increased gender-based violence because of the pandemic, because of the lockdown, because the men were at home. So we heard a lot about that globally. What we actually didn't hear is that in the time of the pandemic, which was like health, but also economic pandemic and no livelihood opportunities available outside, it was women and their groups who took the leadership in finding jobs. So while they were facing violence at home, they were the ones who were actually going and finding work, because it was easier to find domestic work and finding work as compared to men. They were the ones in the lockdown situation, and particularly in India, it was such a harsh lockdown that police were on the street and they were literally beating up people who were on the street. So if you are a trader and wanted to go out and sell, and if you're a male and a female trader, it was much better if you are female, because you had a better chance not getting beaten up by police as if you're a male trader. So there also women took leadership. So these community institutions that existed before, this mass social capital that existed, that swung into action, and that not only responded with things like the masks, taking care of the most vulnerable. So, for example, these groups knew who were the most vulnerable and who they had to reach out to. So for example, all the schools were shut down. Okay, and in these communities, the kids get one meal from school, which is nutritious. Now, once the schools were shut down, these kids had no access to a nutritious meal, which was the only source of nutrition for them. Now, these groups knew that this will be a problem, and then instead of supplying the milks to close down schools, they started distributing that home delivery of these meals so that the kids at least have one meal. Taking care of lactating mothers, taking care of a person with disability. So these kind of outreach was done by these groups. So when it comes to inclusion, showing resilience, and so these groups were at the forefront. Now, what it means in terms of going forward, I mean, in many aspects, we are still in the middle of the pandemic. Things are still evolving. And these groups have shown tremendous leadership, entrepreneurship in dealing with these challenges. Now, what it means going forward. Now, these groups, be it the self-help groups in India or producer companies or VSLAs in Africa, these groups have existed for a long time, for decades, but they never got the recognition and the attention from the formal economy. But this time, I think a spotlight has come on them. So how this can be carried forward in rehabilitation, rebuilding the economy would be crucial. Let me come to the second point around the disruption of the supply chains. We all know, because of the lockdowns, the major global supply chains were disrupted. But what we also saw was that this sudden influx of activities in the local economy. So, for example, again, going back to our partner Seva, what they experienced that, and this was the time when the crops were coming out and the centralized marketplaces were closed. So where do you, as a producer, where do you take your crop? On the other hand, the consumers didn't have access to fresh produce. So what they started to do, and this is just not Seva, there are other graduates who are part of these farmer producer organizations, which are very close to communities. They started to take orders in a very informal way, because the system was still evolving. They started to get orders on WhatsApp. And if they received the orders by 6 p.m., they delivered the vegetables by 8 a.m. in the morning, home delivery. So these kind of sudden sort of increase in local economy increased because of the pandemic. And in some ways, this can actually show the potential that exists in the local players. The third thing, I'm sure I'm doing okay on time. The third thing is around the technology. What happened, and this again in India, first time the usage of internet in the rural areas increased as compared to urban areas, first time. And it happened because people had to use it to access, for example, education, to access information. So there's this sudden increase in use of technology. Now, what does that mean in terms of the community groups and community institutions? Now, the sudden influx of technology usage, obviously there is potential, and the technology, the new technologies also come with challenges. For example, before, these groups were federated into producer companies or federations. Now, with the use of technology, do you actually need those federations, or can they be digital? Can they be virtual? Because in a digital economy, data is currency. So how do you actually control that? How do you actually ensure that communities have control over that data, and then more and more they are using it? And what we found out was that there is so much knowledge gap in terms of what the technologies are and what the potential is, and there's so much education need to happen, not only at the community level but also at the service provider level. And I mean, right now I'm actually doing a course on future of work, and we are looking at different technology pillars, and one of the things we are looking at is blockchain, for example, and the potential that technology has in terms of, for example, digitizing the land records. We know how important access to asset is, and that technology has the potential to transform how these land records are kept. Now, how does that happen? Do even the service providers, NGOs, have enough knowledge about it? And so there is a lot of knowledge building, a lot of education needs to happen in that area. And finally, and I'll end after this, is around the linkages between these informal community grassroots groups and the civil society, the formal NGOs. And what we saw and what we heard from our graduates is that where these where there were strong links. So for example, there is one group that came up right during the time of the pandemic in India. It's called RCRC, Rapid Community Response to COVID. It's an association of about 12 grassroots organizations. They came together and they looked at, and together they had access to over 6 million households that they were directly serving. Now, the aggregation of them as one organization enabled them to access resources, because there was credibility of that organization. It enabled them to gather mass amount of data. For example, data is very, very important when you want to talk about how many migrant workers came, in terms of contact tracing, in terms of actually doing action research going forward. So they were able to do, first of all, direct work with these groups with 6 million families, and also mobilize funding so that going forward that can be used. So I mean, these while the grassroots level groups are really really good in terms of the outreach, inclusion, resilience, but just working them alone in terms of sustainability and aggregation, what we heard, what we are learning in groups like RCRC, can go in terms of recovery and long-term solutions. So I'll end there, Duncan.
Wonderful, super grounded experiences and insights. Duncan, so we have one last specific kind of thoughts for you, and then we have a sea of amazing questions that we'll turn to.
That's your polite way of saying keep this short, right?
Yeah, more or less.
Okay. All right, fine. I get it. I hear you. All right, 2 points then. One is very interested in the gendered aspects of the response, which you raised, Yogesh. I mean, I think gender norms are often transformed in shocks or coming out of shocks. Wars, classic, is the big study, but shocks generally. When women are involved in prior organization like Sewa in India, that it's turbocharged the ability to respond and make the most of that of the opportunity. So I just think I'm very glad you saved us on this one, and it's one of the things we definitely want to cluster on some aspect of this, whether it's women's rights and feminism, women's economic livelihoods. We need to think about this, but it's clear that the response is gendered, and we need to reflect that in the work we do. The second one is on your supply chain issue. That wasn't a question. Okay, sorry. The only question I've got is on your supply chain issue. So people are celebrating the fact that global supply chains, which were already under pressure and starting to look a little bit shaky, have now fallen apart, and there's a lot of relocalization, economic relocalization going. Will it actually stay? Once markets are, assuming we get back to the normal functioning of trade and markets, to what extent do you think this is actually a tipping point? And to what extent will it be like Argentina in 2000, where everybody introduces local currencies, but then as soon as the crisis has gone, they go back to business as usual?
Yeah, great question, Duncan. I think this, as I said before, this movement, this particular moment of COVID, sort of put a spotlight on what is possible and what the potential is in terms of these groups to deliver. Now, some of the things that were in pipeline. So let me just give you an example of India. There are over 230 there are 65 million groups that exist of different types of self-help groups. Okay, and then there are about 7,000 producer companies. So these are producer-owned, producer-operated companies, work basically on the lines of a cooperative, but they are under the company's regime. And there are like 7,000 of them. And there was a significant change made in the year 2002, where the producers could come together as a company so that they can better partner and they don't have to go through the cooperative bureaucracy. So it came in 2002, and then there has been slow increase in the formation of these producer companies. They're called farmer producer organizations as well. Now, and you can become member only if you're a producer. You cannot become a member of these companies if you're a processor, if you're a landowner. You have to be a producer to be. Now, so there is a slow sort of progress, and the numbers are on the rise of these companies. Now, what happened during the lockdown, where these companies were allowed to actually go and do home delivery or do direct sales. So they were given these licenses, and they actually got this opportunity to do that, to sell, to buy from the producers and sell it to the local consumers. Now with technology and increased use of technology, these groups, they definitely have the potential to build on if the right investments are made. So there are a couple of policy changes that recently that happened in India. With the intention is that they will support creation of these farmer producer organizations. So if the timing is right, yes, there is potential to actually invest. And again, I think the key area is, because they're out of the 7,000, not all of them are at the same level. Some are far better than the other. There are a lot of issues around capacity, professionalization, leadership development. There are linkages with the government, huge issues around financing of these community institutions, right? So, but if this opportunity is taken and right investments are made into building that capacity, making sure that that they do remain inclusive and close to community, then I do see them active participants in the value chains. Not only, I mean, obviously priority would be local value chains, but also being participant in the global value chains.
Wonderful, Yogesh. So quite a few questions as well, people wanting to understand more and more and more about well-being and the kind of knock-on effects of the carers on the people who've been moving, and food systems, reference to agroecology. But let me zoom out now. We've been collecting some questions, and these are questions, I think we'll have a couple of rounds of 3 or so questions each. And again, what we don't get to, we will definitely have all of these that we'll share back to you and will inform the cluster discussions that follow on. So the first one really is about the intersection between movements or, in your case, Catherine, faith-based organizations, or Yogesh, initiatives. So where are different groupings or agencies kind of meeting each other, and where are you seeing synergies, but also where are you seeing clashes? There was a fascinating question about the far right, also movements obviously coming up, and how are they intersecting and emerging in relation to COVID. So really some reflections on the intersection and synergies and conflicts there. Catherine, you've had the most time to sit back and think. How about we turn to you first?
Well, it's a big world, and these things are taking place in very different ways. And it is interesting also, as we are involved in so many webinars, that the rhythm of the COVID pandemic is very different in different places. That, in some places it seems to be over, whereas in others it's just starting. Looking through the faith lens, clearly there are interesting questions around the interfaith. And in fact, there seems to be less evidence of different religious communities at local levels working together than we might have hoped. And there are obviously a lot of examples of, Christians and Muslims coming together on a specific challenge, but it does seem as if there's more tendency for faith communities to be focusing on their own, so to speak, than the contrary. Some of another set of questions, which also reflect some of something I saw in the chat, is how some of the big global issues. So we're focusing very much on the G20 and what the G20 might do, which includes action on debt, as well as the financial packages and some of the big accountability issues. So how far is the sort of advocacy for bolder debt action linked back to the way people say in Zambia or in another country are looking at these issues? And in the Jubilee movement has taken different forms, and it still exists, but I was really frankly quite surprised to find how little the big interfaith organizations, Religions for Peace, for example, had really focused on debt issues. They had not historically had much involvement. And so it's been a process of sort of bringing some of the local voices into it. I think
you're talking about kind of like a global, national, kind of
global, national, local. How does it work? And then how do those intersections, so to speak, the vertical, how do they relate to other issues? And of course, on gender issues, for example, in some cases you have opposition. I mean, you have the unholy alliances that are dealing with some of the reproductive health issues and so forth. But you also, and this is the thing always to remember, that, and it's a schizophrenic, that some of the faith action is the most progressive you can imagine, and some of it is not. So how are these groups intersecting and interacting? So in some ways, it does bring the climate change issues as more of a unifying theme than, for example, gender. We would like to think that children, even reforms of education that are prompted by the COVID emergency and the fact we had 1.6 billion children out of school or whatever. How are communities reacting to some of these issues?
Okay. We probably won't have time for 5 minutes on each question from every panelist. So maybe a couple of minutes, Lawrence and Yogesh, and then we'll have time for a few more questions. Lawrence first, please. So the question of intersections and what you're seeing, holy or unholy alliances or agnostic ones.
I think if you drill down and imagine within any small group, you're going to find different people pulling in different directions. I think that's quite natural. And I think it's quite natural sometimes both for people to say, if they've come at it from a more activist viewpoint, to say, actually, we could help the people that we're trying to work with better by neutralizing that, trying to fit within a safer framework. Or conversely, you could imagine community groups going, we are going to get totally ignored and left here to die unless we get a lot more militant. So that fluidity, I think, is quite normal. I think those are ongoing discussions within groups and then within wider movements, wider contexts. There is a big question as to whether respectability politics freezes out activists or not. So around the debt issue 20 years back, there was some quite productive alliance building between very radical groups at summit protests and much milder, more policy-oriented NGOs lobbying within those. And then at other periods, there were moments of total distancing. Oh no, we don't have anything to do with those scary, dangerous people. So that's a choice particularly for the more powerful partners. And it's a choice partly that NGOs, religious organizations and so on make based on their assessment of how states and similar, even more powerful actors are going to respond. Are they being asked to distance and marginalize themselves from more radical groups, or can they in fact work effectively together? For example, perhaps around climate issues, is that possible?
Great. Well, on climate, Yogesh, there were a few questions about why has no one mentioned climate? I mean, we have now in the Q&A, but where is climate activism? And is that one of the frontiers where you're seeing some of the value chains work that you're involved in climate, intersecting perhaps or not, or just other observations on the intersections?
Sorry, my mic was closed. Yes, absolutely. I think if you look at the localization of the value chain, obviously that is, I mean, there's less footprint, and the more you buy local, the better it is for the environment. Absolutely, from that point of view as well, this pandemic actually tells us that all the centralized model of everything coming to one centralized warehouse and then distributed has a huge environmental footprint. So absolutely, from that point of view, there are a lot of learnings here why we should be talking about a more local value chain. And also, I think in terms of the if you look at the size of some of these activities, and I mean, earlier I think it was Catherine who talked about the Gandhian philosophy of an economy where you have everything within that you need. Maximum should be available within your village. That's the Gandhian idea of an economy which is self-sufficient and less destructive to the environment. And I think some of our partners, I think in particular, I would again like to talk about Seva. They talk about this 100-mile communities, building an economy of nurturance, an economy that actually nurtures the environment, nurtures people. And how do you look at those 100-mile communities, building those 100-mile communities where everything is sort of produced and consumed within those boundaries? I mean, the idea is great, but I think there's something really to think about. I mean, I think recently there was something in Paris that they're trying to get everything within the 15-minute walk, that everything that you need is available within the 15-minute distance. So those ideas, obviously, I think it's time to sort of think about, push those ideas. Now, going back to, I think this intersectionality of or intersection of different groups, and I think within what we learned in our sort of our interaction with some of our graduates is that when it comes to like agency, and we are talking about emergent agency. Now, when I think of those migrant workers who were stuck in the urban location, what was the reason they were there? They were there because the rural economy was not able to provide them enough livelihood. So they go to urban areas. Now they create a livelihood, they earn an income. But as soon as that source was ended, what were the options? I mean, if you look at individual human agency, what was left with them? If there was anything left with them, they would stay back in the urban areas. There was nothing left. So what they did, they decided to walk back. Now, if you look at, like, as they were walking back, who was helping them? The state was almost absent. In some cases, I mean, initially, actually they restricted their movement as well. What we saw was this mutual, I think in Duncan's blog, he talks about mutual added groups. So we saw that citizens coming on the street with milk packets and food, and then they started to give them without like any motivation from anywhere. So those groups actually helped those migrant workers, and the migrant workers actually appreciated that help. But that they kept moving on, and where were they moving on? They were moving on where they thought that they had the most support besides the income. So they wanted to go back to their families. They wanted to go back to the institutions where they thought that they could get help. And the first ones who could actually help them was, again, I mean, is women folks who were able to not only weather the crisis, but also and also to be the one who got to hear from the returning man and got beaten up, but still they were the ones who were expected to go find work, cook at home, and deliver the meal, and also make sure.
We're going to have to round off, Yogesh, to have time for more questions. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. I think that the whole the notion of kind of geography of intersections and kind of time-based, that there's a lot of networks of experience and mutual aid that there's a different kind of intersection than the organizational ones that we have to keep in mind as well. Sorry to cut you off, but we have got so many questions, and I'd like, if possible, for the panelists, could we have shorter responses, because then we can get through a few more questions. I've kind of primed Lawrence already on the question that's come up several times around the relationship between state and civic space, actually, and whether there's a giving of more space for mutual aid. John Gaventa also was talking about this notion of repressive agency popping up, and whether that's going to shift values and norms towards the idea of a small state or actually a more all-powerful state. What reflections have you got from the examples that you've been curating, Lawrence?
So I'm going to be as brief as I can for a huge and very important question. States ask themselves, how far do we need consent and popular buy-in, and how far can we repress things? And scarily, over the last 5 to 10 years, we have seen a big shift towards the repressive. India, China, Turkey, France, the US, or whatever. There are far more states going, we can repress stuff, and we can do it effectively, and we can even bring in right-wing movements, in inverted commas, as foot soldiers for this in several places. That is still quite experimental. It may or may not be working. The more it is perceived to be working by states, the more other states will do it, because there is a bigger crisis underlying this, clearly. So we saw 70s, 80s, 90s, a decline in authoritarianism. We're now clearly seeing a rise. That also plays itself out in movements. In the later 20th century, we saw big, stable movement coalitions that were often quite institutionalized, were recognized as major players. We are now maybe in some cases falling back into a late 19th century situation where on the one hand, there are little radical groups, things happening in marginal communities, and then occasionally insurrections. But there isn't the space for that big movement-linked party, the stable union that can actually push things and so on and so forth. So these things are up for grabs at the moment, and different actors, both movements from below, but also different state coalitions, are trying to construct new situations. So we're asking the wrong question if we say, what way are these things going? The right question is to say, what world are actors trying to create? And how likely are they to be successful? It's nice to see in the US they are not always successful. Whatever comes next, that particular model isn't doing so great any more than the British version of it. And we might hope to see that some of these authoritarian experiments can be pulled apart or pushed apart.
Catherine, kind of tying into this, there was also an interesting question about I guess what you were referring to as the very, very good and the very, very bad versions of faith-based organizations, and whether those are, how that might tie into this question. I mean, we're talking about such complex dynamics, I understand, but any thoughts from what you've been exposed to?
Well, the wide variety of relationships between governments and religious bodies is something that I think we should be focusing on more, so that you do have the full range of sort of theocratic states to countries that are really quite aggressively standoffish or repressive. So I think that's the issue that a number of people are focusing on is the sort of majority minority and the ways in which pluralism are being addressed in different places. And then, of course, the question that we're looking at here, which is how is COVID affecting that? Is it accentuating the persecution of certain minorities? That certainly one of the questions that's surprising is that the evidence of what are called violations of religious freedom, in other words, which is often oppression of minorities, though there also are many gender dimensions in that. All of the databases that people have are showing a worsening in different regions. So it's not just in, one place. It's pretty much across the board, and there are very few good answers as to why. I realize that that's going down a rabbit hole, but it does come back to some of these questions about that I think it's dangerous to generalize about too much, about the ways in which majority religious communities deal with government. So you have, Saudi Arabia, Mauritania, and then, you have France, and how is France or Japan? Let's take Japan, or the Philippines, where you have a much more of a mosaic of relationships.
Thank you, Catherine. Yogesh, on the question of government, civic society responses in a minute and a half, let's say.
Yeah, actually, we saw a lot in terms of government responses. I mean, and if I look at situation here in the global north and how the countries responded here. I mean, for example, here in Canada, as soon as the lockdown was announced, a package was announced as well for all the people who lost their jobs in terms of the emergency relief. And now people are talking about having a universal basic income. Unfortunately, similar thing was not in place in many countries in the global south, that kind of immediate response. So this idea of a universal social protection, how that can that can be more push for that. And also I think in terms of like what the government did, obviously there were very strict lockdown, very strict measures taken, and then there is slowly lifting of these lockdowns. But also there some places, and I think there were a lot of sort of discourse going on and protests from the labor unions, again in India, with some of the recent changes that came because of after COVID in the labor laws, labor codes. And many of the groups actually questioned some of the moves which were not in favor of the workers, because the enterprises which are facing financial sort of constraints now, they want to squeeze the labor and wages. So how the new legislation will allow them to do it. So there were a lot of protests from the labor union movement there as well. So those things.
Okay, wonderful. So we, before we move on to the cluster conveners and the kind of follow-on conversations, one last question, which is a little bit pragmatic, really. There are a few questions is like, well, what can outsiders do? Can anyone, I mean, there's so many academics, think tanks, NGOs, others working on social justice and poverty reduction and fighting inequality. Is there anything that can be done to amplify or support, or should we just stay out of the way? I'm making a very kind of like royal we. Lawrence, I see your finger.
I'm going to say one of the big things that happens in these processes is people learning to see themselves as agents. That's a learning process, understanding the capacity to be an agent, to be a subject beyond the sphere that you've already inhabited, and usually collectively, and understanding that you have a knowledge of, for example, how people's livelihoods work, which is not available elsewhere. That's a slow process, but it's one that people can be helped in, not so much from above, but by putting them in contact with one another. So the process of helping people to make alliances, to recognize peers, to think about, oh, we're like that. That's something that a limited amount of help can actually go a long way. The technical stuff, people recognize those needs, but this is it's a kind of learning that people don't always recognize until they're some way along it. They recognize it more easily in others. So put people in touch with their peers.
Wonderful. And we're certainly hoping that the follow-up conversations and the clusters might enable some of that. And if not, we'll be sure to pursue it. Catherine.
Just very briefly, ideas matter. And I think they matter particularly during this period when there's so much uncertainty. And so I think that contributing some clarity, and I do think that the clarity needs to include building bridges. In other words, trying to find ways to bring people together. That's certainly in the United States, the polarization is very frightening. And it is not an easy challenge now, whether it's, on any of the many perspectives of polarization, including the religious, but somehow presenting issues in thoughtful ways. Obviously, people love facts and statistics, but they also love stories. So how do we think a lot more about this communication challenge?
Wonderful challenge for sure about bridges. Yogesh, can outsiders do anything? Those who are, whether you're in academia or civil society or banking for all I care, or do we just stand back?
No, I mean, there's a lot. I mean, this action research, telling these stories to everyone, I think is very, very important. Gathering this evidence that, okay, these groups can actually deliver. I mean, so if you look at the cost efficiency, there's always question whether they will be able to deliver. Think about informal women in informal sector producing 230 million masks and delivering them to hospitals and local communities. Look at the cost efficiency. Look at the outreach. So I think that these stories need to be documented and highlighted for sure. And how do you build that movement around localization? Unless you tell these stories, unless you gather evidence and tell, it's pretty hard. So for those producer companies, for them to actually become part of global supply chains, we need to tell these stories. And with technology, for example, tomorrow the technology comes and we are able to do fair tracing of a product and a fair price for that product. How do we actually ensure that the last mile delivery of the profit goes to the woman farmer or the most marginalized? For that level of impact, you need investments in these organizations. You need to gather evidence that there is leadership, there is entrepreneurship at the grassroots. So I think these stories definitely need documentation and further digging deep and further analysis and sharing.
I think that there's some really fascinating common themes coming out here about stories not being captured by your own biases in narratives, connection, listening, just wonderful. And this rounds off this part of it. Thank you hugely to the panelists and all the participants for the fantastic questions. These are all being captured and will really enrich the follow-up discussions. So this whole project on Emergent Agency is an experiment. We didn't know if it was a thing. It seems to have allowed a lot of people to find each other, similar curiosities, hopefully groups that are coming together in listening and learning will be part of the clusters going forward. But please, if you have more ideas about what you think might be fascinating as a way of working or a route, or please let us know. What we have in any case identified, and this really has come up through people just reaching out as we put out our call, is that there are a number of a number of themes that are emerging around which people are really interested to convene. And so I'm going to give the floor, really, I'm going to be super tight. You get 55.5 seconds, folks. So in 55 seconds, I would like to walk through, I think about 4 or 5 of these clusters. The idea of these clusters is that they will have one convener, and some of these conveners are on this call. Kitty will hear from you as well. Some of them weren't able to make it now. And we have a number of anticipated clusters that I will mention, but for which we don't have a pitch quite yet. And the idea of the clusters is that you can sign up. We expect them to be smaller discussion groups. They will be focusing on examples and case studies. And we will bring, we have the opportunity to bring some of these clusters together again to connect and share and cross-analyze patterns. But the clusters are, surprise, surprise, faith with Catherine Marshall and her partner in crime, Olivia Wilkinson, livelihoods, Yogesh, social movements, Lawrence, children and youth, Kitty Baraksi, who's an AFC fellow, HIV with the convener cluster, Felicia Wong from Frontline AIDS, education with Liz Robinson, and then the ones that we anticipate and are hopeful might still emerge are on women's rights organizations and leadership, because there's a huge body of material coming out there, local humanitarianism, and money and taxation. But for those who are here and present, a 1 minute, less than 1 minute pitch. Lawrence, kick us off.
We are going to put our heads together with whoever is interested and wants to do that, trying to cast a sieve out, cast a net, see what's happening, and can we frame it? Can we dig out some of the overarching themes of how people at the grassroots in conflict are coming together in new ways or changing what they're already doing? Are they being effective? Are they being defeated indeed, as John Gaventa is suggesting in the chat, by repressive agency? What way are things going, and how might we expect that to develop after the pandemic crisis subsides? I think that's what we're going to do, but it will be self-organized.
Absolutely, the best kind of discussion. Right, moving on to Yogesh, livelihoods. Why should people join you in thinking this through?
Well, we all want a future, Build Back Better, which is inclusive of everyone. So from that standpoint, I think all the stories that we are hearing during the pandemic, I think, and all the sort of increased attention to the local economic development, I think for this to become part of the new normal, I think these stories need to be documented and shared. So the areas we will be sort of focusing on is obviously sustainable livelihoods, women's economic empowerment, social entrepreneurship, and also role of technology in creating a more sort of just future for all. I think so. These are and what this particular sort of moment tells us, what we can learn to push some of this. But along with me, I think there are other colleagues here at the Coady Institute who might be interested in other themes and maybe leading other themes as well. Wonderful. So in the area of climate change, resilience, women's leadership, and peace building, so some areas where we would be offering more.
Excellent. So these clusters are starting point clusters, but we expect more to come out of the woodwork. Catherine, why should we join you?
Our starting point is to bring this huge, complex, unwieldy octopus world much more into the discussions about civil society. So it's trying to break down some of the barriers that we sense exist. More specifically, there are a lot of gaps in the knowledge that we've been able to build up about what's happening. So filling in gaps. Secondly, moving towards a clearer research agenda. And then the third is finding better ways, as we're trying to do in the G20 interfaith effort, to bring the best of the ideas and the best of the experience from these religious worlds into policy processes in bilateral agencies, multilateral agencies, UN, etc. So that's the pitch.
Wonderful. Okay. Kitty Baraksi, I'm going to give you 1.5 minutes because we haven't seen you yet or heard you.
Yeah, hi everyone. So I'm an FC fellow, as Irene already mentioned it, and I have been working with children and youth, and especially for long years with trauma communities. And I'm also now working on urban conflicts with children and youth. So this is my connection to the topic, and I will be coordinating this cluster on children and youth, which is a huge topic. I think it's really complicated to sum it up, and I think it will have so many different directions to go. So, but yeah, I think that it's very clear that there is this very important topic to see how children and youth responded to this situation, and there will be a lot of overlaps, I think, with other topics, for example, education, for sure. And I think that, but for me, after listening to this discussion, I was taking notes on the importance of rethinking the concept of agency related to children and youth, because it's definitely different. And I think it's also very important to see how can we produce together knowledge with children and youth in a way that is accessible to them. So these are the main thoughts that I would share here, but there are a lot of topics to discover and explore. So yeah.
Wonderful. Lovely to see you here. Felicia, over to you.
Hi, I'm Felicia. I'm the head of innovation at Frontline AIDS. We're a partnership of around of organizations focused on community action on HIV in over 40 countries, and just saw this as a great opportunity to look at what does that community response look like, because we've heard a lot of stories around our community-based partners pivoting, responding to COVID-19. And also we focus primarily on really the most marginalized and excluded from society. And so, the COVID-19 has also exacerbated existing inequalities and vulnerabilities. And so, looking at kind of how people have kind of drawn on the experience they've had through the HIV response, but then also looking at the intersectionalities of, because, we know that people are just not impacted by HIV, they're impacted by, poverty and other aspects, and how we can kind of draw those experiences together. And so I think this is I think the discussion group will be kind of looking at intersectionalities, marginalization, but then also kind of other people's interests and what stories that they're hearing.
Thank you so much, Felicia. I was actually just looking at some work from the Salamander Trust, who's been doing some wonderful webinars about how COVID has been amplifying some of the difficulties they're finding. An amazing initiative as well. So the only person who is a confirmed convener for the education cluster actually couldn't make it just now. Her name is Liz Robinson. And she has been, her particular interest is really focusing on supporting education in low resource contexts as the key to community self-driven development. And she's based in Amman, and she will be your host, I guess, your guide for the education cluster. And as I mentioned, money and taxation, women's rights organizations and leadership and local humanitarianism, hopefully also on the table going forward. So it looks like we might actually round off early. So a couple of last messages. The 26th is when we had planned the cluster convenings to start. We will send out communication on that, how to sign up. We will be organizing it, morning, afternoon sessions available. Keep sending in examples, please, because we have 10 months going forward to keep looking at this. And we see it as a giant snowball, which is like the worst metaphor if you're not in a wintry climate, but this growing balloon of insights. It is just the beginning. It's only as good as we all make it together. And what we have the opportunity to hire a research assistant to create a database that will be available to everybody. And we are working with 4 or 5 countries as well to do some of the scouting of these lesser heard examples. We hope in particular, Lawrence, that you were referring to, getting better sources, having antenna. We call them our prairie dogs as a metaphor. So if you're interested in the research assistant post and can help us cluster and make available this material, please get in touch with Duncan, myself, or any of the other names that you have found in this journey. And thank you so much for being here today. I've thoroughly enjoyed and been intrigued by all the presentations and the insights and questions. So on that note, the gift of time, 6 minutes. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.